it now. And Billy, you are good to go.
Cool. All right. So I'll share my screen. Here we are. So yeah, thank you for joining, guys. This is I'm really excited to do this. So just to introduce the name of our event here, the name of our talk is Just-in-Time Learning Techniques for Unblocking Yourself. So my name's Bill. I'm a software engineer at Facebook right now, which gets us to our fun intro slide. So I've got almost 10 years of experience writing code at this point in my life. I've worked in all kinds of different environments, from like big companies, small companies. Nathaniel, who is here, can attest to some of our very small days together when it was really just kind of me, him, and I think one other person for a little while. So I've worked at all different kinds of environments, like just different like places that are managed very differently too. So places that are sort of top down of like management says, and then bottom up of like the rank and file are sort of in charge in a lot of ways. I've started my own companies. I've worked at all kinds of different places in all kinds of different industries. At this point, I've worked in a lot of different programming languages. I really just listed the main languages here of like C# and Ruby and JavaScript and Python and SQL. I know isn't like a real programming language, but I've gone deep enough in that world that it felt useful to include. And like lots of different frameworks in all of these things. So I've like sort of the purpose of sharing all of this is that I'm trying to discuss here the fact that like I've learned a lot, and I've had to be in an environment where I've had to learn a lot, because just through my years of experience, like every new job, every new project, it's like I seem to be picking up a new language, and that results in getting stuck, which is sort of how we learn to be good about getting ourselves unstuck. So anyway, moving on a little more, like the last couple of years I've been at Facebook, which has been like kind of a cool experience in and of itself. But we're here to really talk about the wider thing. And one last piece, I tend to specialize in doing a lot of like 0 to 1 efforts, or MVPs as we might call them. So new products that, that I'm building for whatever reason. Anyhow, I'll stop there. Does anybody have any questions about my background before we dive in a little further? And feel free to speak up. I can't see everybody right now. But if not, we can keep going. All right, I see CM's got a thumbs up. All right, cool. We'll keep going. All right. So come on, go. There we go. So just kind of a thing to keep in mind while we're going through this, like writing code is really just a constant process of learning. And this is really important to keep in mind because, like as an engineer, you never really want to be doing the same thing more than once. Because the idea is like I write a piece of code, let's say that I want to format a timestamp, so an integer, into a string that says like, the date. So today is September 14th, for example. Like that's not a piece of code that I want to have to rewrite in my life. And so the hope is like, I'm going to write it, I'm going to learn about it while I'm writing it, and then I'm going to move on to the next thing. And so all the time while we are engaged in this process of writing code, we're also engaged in this process of learning about a new kind of a problem or a new context area for that problem. And so that always sort of puts us in this position of where we're having to learn about new things. So, I'm hitting the wrong button here for my next slide. There we go. So I like to try to think of this as a 3-step process. So the first step being deciding what kind of code that you want to write, like what your requirements are. Do you have to interact with other teams? Do you have to interact with other like different types of users? Do you only have one kind of user? Those types of decisions. Step 2 here is learning. Which is largely just trying to figure out, okay, like, I've never had to set up like an A/B test. Let me learn about what that's like, what I have to do to make that happen in the code so that I can measure something and get an outcome. And then the last step of it that, is just writing the code, which is the part that, like when you're sort of earlier in your career, I feel like you spend almost all of your time writing. And the more time that I spend, the more that I'm finding I actually spend the least amount of time writing code and the most amount of time talking about the decisions of how, what are we going to write, and then learning about the systems or the processes in place that we're going to use to write the code itself. And so like all of these are very, very important things. However, for the purpose of this talk, we are going to focus on learning and just sort of this step, but a very particular part of this step. And so this gets us to this concept of like, if you're stuck, right? Like everybody's been through this if you've written code, whether you've written just literally your first web page ever that says like HTML, body, hello world, and that's it. Like there's some part of that that can be very like difficult to figure out, or some sort of like learning that you might have to go through to keep going. But before you get that far, you usually go through these kind of steps of like, I'm kind of frustrated. Like, I feel like I've just been banging my head on the wall. I've tried all of these different ways to complete this task and nothing is working. Like, why is the screen not updating properly? Like, why is my compiler yelling at me? Why is the linter in my IDE just constantly complaining to me and saying, hey, you're not doing this correctly, please fix it. We tend to call this being blocked within the industry. So what it just means is like it's more of like an official term of you just being completely stuck. This is something that we fully expect to happen to everybody all the time. And it's an important thing to call out in just sort of like your team to say, like, I'm blocked right now. I'm trying to figure out ways to move forward, right? Because it's like, what can you do? Like if you're stuck, there is, you can sit there and stew about it, or you can try to find ways to move forward. So a really important quote is part of this too. Good players adapt well. I actually didn't know the last word was part of this quote until I looked it up. But good players adapt is something that I've heard a lot in my life. Just sort of like, this is related to sports, but it applies to coding as well, of like, if you are trying a particular strategy to solve a problem or accomplish a goal, then when you encounter some sort of strife or difficulty, you want to adapt yourself and you want to try something a little bit different to see if you can do something better or differently, or just otherwise as a way to get around whatever it is that you're stuck on. So we're going to start real quick with dividing this up into sort of two buckets. So the first bucket are self-serve learning techniques. And so these are things that you can do on your own. And this is actually sort of an interactive part. So if anybody can answer this question, I would love to hear like, what are some of the resources that you can use to learn by yourself? So this is like, I'm stuck, what do I do? Like, what's the next thing that you would do to unstick yourself? And feel free to just speak up again.
Google it.
Okay, so I would go to like search for the keyword, go to Stack Overflow or any site, like how they are going to solve this problem, or search the keywords like what this process does, and go for MDN web docs or anywhere to look for the things, what are the description, what this code do actually, and how can I bypass it, some sort of like that. So know about the thing, what's going on, and what are the other ways I can fix this thing, and do I have all the knowledge about this code point or this particular code, then I can move forward. Okay, now I can think about other ways. Something sort of that. Yeah.
Okay, so I heard looking things up on the internet, using documentation. Those are both really great things. What else?
Yeah, for me also, like I find constantly like referring to the Google when I stuck on something, especially learning the new language and learning some syntaxes. I find myself constantly referring to the Google, like Stack Overflow and some sort of like that.
Did you say Stack Overflow?
No, I mean like just the internet. Like I just put in the Google, like the syntax. Whatever comes first, I'll go with that.
Yeah, totally. Using the syntax in Google is another great way to do it beyond the keywords. I mean, I know I do that all the time.
Yeah.
All right, maybe let's get one more and then we can move on. Nobody? Anybody else? Or have we covered it? Is Google sort of our biggest? I mean, it really is our biggest resource if we're being honest. All right, cool, move on. So this is, oh, come on, there we go. So this is sort of an incomplete list. I think this list could go on forever and ever and ever. And I think we kind of hit it on the head here. Like we've got Google, we've got Stack Overflow, which really you just find through Google 99% of the time. like reading the documentation for whatever it is that you're doing. I tend to find tutorials I like a lot, whether they're like on Medium or just somebody's blog. I have some friends who are really big into YouTube for this kind of thing. I'm not really a video person when it comes to learning, but it's a great resource that's out there. And then there are like audio versions of these things too. Like Clubhouse has been really big in the, I guess the last year, kind of, depending on your community or the types of things that you have found. But like, keep in mind too, this is by far not a complete list. There's a ton of things you can do on your own, but they're all sort of by yourself, right? And so that gets us into this other bucket that we really want to discuss. And this is what the part that I want to get into, which is team-based learning techniques. And the important part here is to remember coding is a team sport. This is something that I like really, if you take nothing away from today, remember this slide, remember this sentence, that coding is a team sport. Because often in the educational environment, right, like it's kind of about like you in the corner, like doing the thing, reading the textbook, filling out your assignment, or, doing a LEET code problem. And it's usually very solitary. And, the fact of the matter is when you are in your day job and you're writing code all day, like your teammates are actually some of your best resources when it comes to learning, often because they really have seen almost every problem that you are looking at, or some type of problem, because they just know, like they've been around maybe for a little bit longer, or if not, they've just had different experience. And so like being able to rely on that is a really, really key part of being an effective engineer. So we're going to go through a couple of these techniques. Just to sort of talk about what, like what you can do in terms of learning from them. And so the first one is something that I call just talking it out. So you look over at your coworker and you say like, hey, do you have a minute? And then you just really talk it out with them. You say, like, I'm stuck on this problem. My variable isn't changing from this value to that value. I don't know why. And like a lot of the time within about a 5-minute conversation, just talking to someone like makes you think about it in your head in a way that it just completely changes how you're thinking about it. And then you realize like, oh, that's it. Like that's what I need to move forward. And it'll hit you in the moment while you're doing it. And so like, I love this one as an example of sort of like our first one, because it's both really a self-serve learning technique and a team-based learning technique. Because I often find that when I engage in this process of talking with the guy next to me at the, at work, it doesn't even have to be somebody who's an engineer, honestly. I can just talk it out with somebody and like, you kind of get it. And then like in a really fortunate situation, like you don't get it, but they do. And then they'll give you that quick answer of like, oh, you're wrong. Like you just need a semicolon there. That's why that's broken. And then you slap yourself on the head and you say like, damn it, like, why didn't I see that? The downside of this particular technique is it's not very great for very complex problems. Just keeping in mind that like you want this technique to be used in sort of like a short form time frame. Like you don't want this to evolve into like a full hour-long conversation without, just checking with them to make sure like, hey, like, is this okay after, after the first couple minutes, like I'm down to keep discussing this with you, but I don't want to fully derail your like afternoon or whatever it happens to be, because sometimes these things can evolve. And that gets us to our next thing. And this was one that took me a really long time to figure out, which is code review. We often think of code review as this process of like, I'm done, here's my work, please take a look, like, please grade it, please tell me if I did good or bad. And it's actually a really great learning mechanism where we can say like, hey, this is where I'm stuck in the code. I don't really know how to fix this thing or how to get to the next part of this. I've gotten about this far. What do you think? And I often find like this is one of the best mechanisms that I have of learning from my coworkers, or like another way of doing it too is like if you have an idea, say about like refactoring your code or reorganizing, some files if they don't quite make sense, like this is a really great way for you to just say, like this is like to go back, the slide real quick, let's see if it'll go up. Where are we talking it out? So like where talking it out sort of falls apart sometimes is sometimes like the idea is a little bit too complex to talk it out, right? To use words. And so like code review is the perfect way where we can literally just use code as our discussion, like our communication technique. And this is just a really great place to like kind of you play around with different lines of code. They can suggest changes to that code directly. And it allows you to both sort of live in this space together as engineers, like discussing particular lines of code, like one at a time. And the really, like, what I said in terms of like this being a great technique is like, it's better than talking it out sometimes. It's really good for more complex problems of, kind of getting into the lower level logic or, kind of some of the nitty gritty details of when you're coding. The downside of it is that I think there can be a lot of overhead, when it comes to like getting unblocked in a sense, because in order to submit code to review, you pretty much have to know enough to put something up, right? Like I can't just like put up a thing and put one comment, although sometimes I do, but the results aren't particularly great, where you say like, this is kind of where it's breaking. I'm lost. I'm not really sure what's going on. Can you help? And I think that's can work, but usually isn't quite as great. And the other thing too is like sometimes it can take a little while for your coworker to respond. Maybe they're on vacation, maybe they're out to lunch, maybe they're in a meeting, and so like you're not going to get that like immediate response that you'll get from talking to them. And so sort of in the next evolution here, we end up in this world of pair programming. And so, this is where you just physically sit there with your coworker and you both stare at the same screen, or, in the pandemic world, you hop on a Zoom call like we're on today. And, one of you shares your screen and you just go through it together as if you're sort of one person. This is an awesome technique of working with your team for when you are like completely stumped. Where you're like, I've got no idea what's going on. I don't know what this code is doing. I don't know what the product is, like when you're just totally lost in the woods. Because often this is a great opportunity for your coworker to step in and say, hey, like just answer all of those small questions and sort of get in there and help teach the things that we need to unblock in a sense. And so it's a good way to ask a lot of questions really quickly. The downside of this, although I only wrote one of the cons, there are two here, is it can take a long time. Like sometimes these can be 1, 2, 3, 4 hour sessions. I think rarely will they go more than like an hour or two, just because people get tired. I mean, it's a lot of overhead to be like staring at the screen and thinking in your head and also talking to the guy next to you. But it's just like really good for having that experience in a sense, and it's a great way too to just sometimes watch your coworker code and say like, what do you do? What are the shortcuts that you use? What are the tools that you use? And how do you look things up? And you can sort of sit there and observe, what they are doing that might be different from you, and you can learn that lesson from them. The other con of this is that you have to actually schedule the pair programming session, and sometimes that can take a little bit out of your day just to because you have to like wait for a big enough block of time in their schedule in order to be able to get on the schedule and sort of do this. So the last one that I really wanted to go over here is team meetings. These are really great for proposing ideas and really great to just get like a poll of your whole team at once and say like, I have this idea, I want to do this thing. What do you guys think? And like this is a really cool one because it allows you to get some really quick feedback, because you're already in a meeting, you don't have to schedule it. And oftentimes like you walk in with the idea, they give you a quick answer and you're able to, either iterate on that and make some changes, or they'll just say like, yeah, that's great. That's a smart idea. Keep going with it. Like you're blocked, but your idea seems like it'll work. Keep following that path. And I love like the quick and easy nature of this. The downside of it though is that it's, again, similar to the code review technique. You really have to come prepared like with a decision in this kind of instance. You can also use team meetings to say, like I'm blocked and I literally have no idea. And that can be helpful, but you're not going to be really polling the team so much as getting somebody to buy in to say like, hey, like let's talk after, let's sit down and look at this together and sort of go through this as a problem. So sorry, my throat was dry. And recap here, the 4 techniques that we sort of talked over here are talking it out, using code review, so saying like, this is what I think we should do, or this is where I'm stuck. Pair programming, again, where you're just really, really stuck and you say like, hey, can we solve this one together? Can you show me how you might do this? And lastly, team meetings where, you say like, hey, this is my proposal. This is what I would like to do. So here we go. Remember this quote from earlier, just to keep putting things in front of you. What's the phrase? Like, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Remember, good players adapt well. And this is really important to remember, because some of the most important things you can do in this is to just continue iterating and continue, like updating the way that you're interacting with people, finding different ways to learn from people, because ultimately every relationship is different and every person has a different learning style, a different communication technique. Every team has a slightly different dynamic, and you'll find that, what worked in your old team doesn't work in your new team. What worked a year ago doesn't work today, because like, more and, or less. In my case, like I just joined a new team and I'm using Python. I've never used Python before. And so like the ways that I'm talking to people have to change in order for me to get that learning, if you will. And again, just to continue driving this home, like play around with these techniques as much as you can, because there are different ways that you'll find that they work for you or that they don't. Find what works best and just keep adapting them. Because ultimately your goal when you're getting unblocked is you need to learn something typically to move forward. And the best way to learn is just to experiment. And this is something that I do all the time with my coworkers, where I throw ideas at them in different ways and I see how they react. And then based off of that, I'll learn how they prefer to, like what is like a good or a bad response that I get out of them, and what's a good response for me. And then that way, like the next time that I go to talk to them, I just know like, hey, like they're, they really like pair programming, they really hate code review, or vice versa, and so it's really good to figure those small little things out about your team. So that's it. That's what I had. If anybody has any questions or feedback, happy to chat more.
I have one question.
Mm-hmm.
First, say like you don't like your coworker is busy or something like that. Is there any website or groups where we can have our like code review like fairly quickly online?
So Stack Overflow is a good option for this. One thing to keep in mind here is make sure that you're not breaking any like NDA type agreements. Like at Facebook, that's a really big thing for me. It's like I can't just go posting the Facebook code all over the internet. Usually you can abstract things enough anyway that it's not a big deal, but like Stack Overflow was literally built for this whole purpose. Quora is another good website, where you can just say like, how do I do X? And you just ask the question and you can get a response.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So I think another thing too that I want to point out is like, I've provided this list of like these 4 techniques that I have considered. And, we talked about this from the self-serve perspective of, there's a couple, but like this list is hardly complete. I think one of the big thing of any type of learning mechanism, in this talk literally being one, is just to remember, like, these are not the only things that are available to you. Like as you sort of, as you go through your day-to-day work, you'll start to see places and times where you learn things. Like sometimes it might just be like you go and you get a coffee with somebody on your team and like they just keep talking all, like all day long. And like sometimes they say really cool things, sometimes they don't. I certainly have a couple coworkers that I just love listening to them sometimes, even though they rant for ages and ages. But that's sort of like a unique thing with like a couple of people that I've found. And I think you always find your own versions of these things. And like, when you find those, start to share those with the people around you too, because you'll find that like, they will equally have discovered their own sort of unique ways of learning and getting unblocked. And just the more that you share as a community, the more that we are all going to learn and all become better engineers over time.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So any other questions?
I don't know if other people have questions, but I actually have a question, just thought of it. So this is more like a kind of like a personal struggle, I would say. So I have been coding for a while, and then for the last 2-3 years, I am not coding at all. Like I stopped technically coding almost. So I guess the question, the one thing I struggled is that in general, like the technology fields moves very fast. Like there's just like too much information, too many new languages. First question is that, is there any technique or any tool you use to archive or concentrate or manage your learning? Because obviously there are some fundamentals of, like, let's say you're doing any of these techniques, talk it out or code review or pair programming. I'm sure when you come out of these sessions, you have learned something interesting and new. Is there any central archive or any learning management systems or tool you use to concentrate all these things in a singular centralized place?
So I've actually iterated on this over the years, and it really depends on the situation that you're in and the kind of how it applies to where you are in terms of like your experience level. Where very early in my career, I wrote everything down. I mean, I have probably somewhere in my apartment like a whole box of notebooks that are just like coding notes, where I literally would just copy down like, hey, I saw this cool thing on Stack Overflow, and I would write it into a notebook. I did that for a long time and found that to be helpful, just to sort of go back, like 3 or 4 pages at a time usually would be all it would take, just to say like, oh, I remember that thing that was cool, but I wouldn't remember like the exact syntax, of how to do a particular thing. And so then I would go back and review the notes. That worked for me for a really long time. And then, I sort of found that as I got a little bit better of a handle on sort of more of the basics of coding, if you will, that became a little bit less useful for me. And so then I moved on to a spreadsheet where I would just write down, sort of quicker notes. So, I'll record like the date, a general category, like a topic, that kind of thing. And then I would write a couple quick notes to say, like I've done this a lot with like learning data structures and algorithms, for example, where like if I'm really looking to do an interview, I'll sit down and I'll just record these things as I'm going through problems, right? Because you spend 30 minutes with a problem and you want to make sure you remember that lesson, whatever it was that you learned from it. Even if that lesson was just, this question sucks, I hate this. Like, that's good to know, so that the next time you go back and you're like, this still sucks, and you're like, hey, that sounds about right. That's what I wrote down last time. But it's really good because you can write that down, and then every time that I would sit down to practice to do some of these like data structures questions, I would just read through my spreadsheet and I would say like, okay, cool, like this thing, like when I was doing graphs, like I had a really big moment where it was like graphs are just like 2D arrays that are mirrored down the middle, and like that was a thing that made sense to me at the time and really helped me to get an understanding about how to write code for graphs. And so like a lot of those lessons were super useful. Nowadays, I would say that I actually write down very little, and part of that is probably not great, but also just because a lot of what I do today is more like the coding has really become less of a focus for me, in a sense, where it's more the people problems that I have trouble with. And so those are the things where I tend to just like mentally take notes as I'm having conversations with people, where like literally just today, like I had a thing where my team has a spreadsheet that we store tasks in, and I was sort of confused about something. And so I raised a point in a meeting, and my coworker was just very against like any kind of change. And so I was immediately thinking to myself like, okay, my approach communicatively was not great. I at the very least, like I know now not to to like change and try something different. So that's not doing like this kind of a method is a little bit less formal in a sense, and it's obviously you can't like go back and just reference your notes if you don't write them down. But I think that all of these things sort of like have a place depending on where you are. CM, sorry, that was a very long-winded way to answer your question.
No. It gives a question, and I think this is a longer conversation in general. Just one thing. The reason I asked this is because a lot of our students are like some of the students are at least in the interview phase, and they face this kind of problem. But we can talk about this more on just managing knowledge. Like there are a lot of things happening in personal knowledge management. I don't know if you know of Diego Forte or August Bradley. There are a lot of people who are working on like that. We have so much information right now, it's difficult to access those information when we need them right on the right time. We mostly just do Google search, and unfortunately Google is not a personalized knowledge tool. It's a distributed, like everyone uses kind of knowledge tool. So all the work we have done in curation of those Google search and knowledge we have to have our own Google of our own brain, like, so like that's the, yeah, but maybe a different conversation altogether. But yeah, it answers some of the questions on how you do it. But yeah, I don't
Yeah, I
want
mean,
to.
there's definitely a lot of tools and products out there, and even just startups that are built entirely around this idea.
Yeah.
That are like
Obsidian, Remnote, Rome Research, Notion has a lot of features like that. So yeah. But
sounds like you're giving the next talk then.
no. I've been struggling a lot with knowledge management. I feel like we are having information overload overall in these days.
Yeah.
But
No,
yeah.
I hear you. This is actually part of the reason why I don't write things down as much anymore. Is my work environment today is so fast paced that when I first started working at Facebook, I was still in this habit of like, I kept a spreadsheet of things. And I just found that by the time I had written something down and then gone back to read it, that knowledge was so out of date because so much had changed between those two periods of time that it just became less useful. And so I have since transitioned, just because of my work environment, into more of this, like, if it's not like on the tip of my tongue, then it's not going to be as useful for me to remember, because everything is always changing so fast. And part of that is because of this exact problem you're having of like, there's just so much knowledge out there and so much information that gets discussed all the time that it's tough to recall it all. And so you just say to yourself, well, like, if it's not immediately in my brain, I probably didn't need to know that anyway.
Yeah, no, makes total sense. Yeah, I do want to hear some questions from other people.
I had some questions. Like when like suppose you are in your workplace, it's 2 p.m, you are stuck in a code, you could not solve it. I mean, you go home or something. So do you still think about the code, or you start from the beginning on the next day? How do you manage that thing and the situation? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I'm just laughing because it's so spot on for the life of an engineer that you're like, sometimes you're just like eating dinner and you're like, I got it. I can't remember how to solve this problem now. Yeah, I've done a lot of that. This sort of hits on a little bit of like work-life balance too. It's really important. Like, we all like to work hard and like succeed and do whatever, and set a goal and achieve it kind of thing, have a task and complete it. And it's important to remember to make sure to like take enough time for yourself mentally to say like, no, work, I'm not going to think about you right now. I'm actually purposely going to go do something else. And actually that's a really good technique for getting yourself unblocked, which is not one that was in my list here for the, let's see, we can go back, for the self-serve techniques, which is like literally sometimes it's just really good, even in the middle of the day. Let's say it's 2 p.m, just stand up from your desk and go for a walk. I did this for a very long time, and I had an office that was also doubled as a modern art museum somehow. I'm not really sure how they did this, but it was a thing. And so there was a lot of like cool art. So I would just like walk around and look at the art while I was thinking about my code. Or even purposely not thinking about my code. And then 10 minutes later, you come back a little bit more refreshed, because sometimes you stare at the same problem for so long that, you just start to miss the basics of it, or you get too in the details of it, that it's better to sort of come back and just try again from scratch. So that is like a really, really helpful thing to do. I actually wish that I did this more today. I think I've just gotten very lazy about actually standing up and leaving my desk. And, part of that's because I've been stuck in my apartment for, we've all been stuck in our apartments for a long time now. Or in CM's case, by the pool, now that he's enjoying it. But yeah, I mean, it definitely happens where like sometimes you're just sitting there and you say like, oh, like like you're in the middle of a movie or something and you're like, oh, that's the answer. That's how I'm going to solve this problem. And then like I get to work the next day, slam down my coffee, I quick type it out and I'm like, yep, that did it. And like sometimes that's what helps.
Yeah. Any other questions from our students or anyone who joined who I don't know? By the way, just for who don't know Algorithm, we are a career bootcamp specifically focused for immigrants in the US. So these are foreign-born international students or immigrants. They came from basically different countries and they have graduated from US schools or they came here through green card and they're just trying to land their first job. So that's what we do. I came to US as an international student around like 13 or like 12 years ago. And I had a really difficult time landing my first job. So that's what we do. We bring in like all these amazing industry experts to share their knowledge. And we we do these sessions every 2 weeks. Like these are guest sessions and we have like a career bootcamp, which is more focused, more hands-on with the students. But that's kind of like the context. So what I'll do, I think we can definitely take more questions. We can probably wrap it up in 20 more minutes. I don't think it will go like insanely long. But any questions, guys? Guys, Billy has a really good like long experience in working in technology. He's working in Facebook, so even if you have questions about Facebook, I mean NDAs and stuff, Billy will understand. But feel free to ask those as well.
I had a quick question. So
Sure.
how important is it to upskill yourself while you're working in the industry? And what are the things that you do yourselves to upskill yourself, like learning, whether it's learning different algorithms or data structure, and how do you do it?
Gotcha. So this question's around like upskilling yourself as you go, basically continuing to learn and grow your career. I would say this is, it's really up to you and where you want to go with your career. Because you might want to learn how to code so that you can become a PM. And like in that case, you don't need to know the latest and greatest version of React or Angular or whatever. You just kind of need to know enough to understand what your engineers are going through. If you're in a position where you want to continue to be an engineer for the long haul, which is basically where I'm at, then it is very, very important to continue to learn. And I think there's a lot of ways that you can do that. And partially, like one of the really important things when it comes down to a career is you have to remember that, like, we all understand that in 2 years, the technology industry is going to move forward in a way that nobody can foresee. It's just going to happen. Things are going to evolve. And that's going to mean all of us, from the people who are just getting started today to the people who've done this for 20 years, are all going to have to go to the documentation and do the hello world tutorial or the to-do list tutorial and learn the new thing. And like, obviously that's a kind of an extreme way of putting it, because really it does also come down to, like where you're working today, the types of code that they use. But in general, I would say that it's actually quite important just to, continue to keep an eye on like, how can you learn? Because that's really what sets apart, I think, a lot of like, let's say like an engineer who's done something for a while versus somebody who's brand new is like having this sort of very humble approach of like, I want to peel back the layers of this puzzle and divide it up into smaller pieces and learn from each of those pieces before I build it back up again. And so like, that's speaking a little bit more generally, if you're talking about, let's say interview processes, as Seam's talking about for a lot of the students here, like, that's something that we just expect that as you get to be more senior, as you have more years of experience, like you get paid a lot more money, but that money comes with a much higher bar for what's expected, of you both in an interview process and in the just in your day-to-day job. Like it's no longer just like, hey, I'm sitting down like doing a task. Like I'm in a place like I'm not the tech lead on my team right now. I was on my previous team, where the job becomes a little bit different, where you're no longer just like coding all day by yourself. You are sort of looking out for your teammates, and you're doing a lot of these like team techniques of like the pair programming, and you focus on the code review a little bit more and try to help everybody else do their jobs a little bit better. And so like those are sort of some soft skills that you start to pick up over time that become really like just deeply important to helping the team function. But then also like looking at the interview point, like when I interview somebody who's brand new, like I'm not going to go as in depth with them. I'm not going to push them as hard as I'm going to push somebody with 10 years of experience. Like those are the people I'm really going to put through the ringer, and I'm going to say like, why do you need that variable? Like what's up with that? You've got, you use it, maybe. Can you get rid of it? Like you're using it in your solution, but can you get rid of it? I want to see you do it with less. And like, you really get nitpicky and try to break people and drive them into their limits, just to see like, what is it that and I'm not saying this is a means to scare you. It's simply, as you spend time, you're always learning, so you'll always be getting better. And that's part of why the interview bars are so different for different levels of seniority, is because at a junior level, we fully expect like you're going to show up and spend about half of your time, maybe more, just learning, reading documentation and just sort of getting your hands in there and figuring out how to do, whatever the types of things are that you've been employed to do. But then like, as you get to be more senior, you're going to spend a lot more time in the reverse of helping other people ramp that up, and, figuring out a lot of these, knowing a lot of these things, and sort of continue to figuring out like harder problems.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sweet, guys. By the way, I just posted a feedback form. If you can submit, this is anonymous, and just anything which we can improve in this session which you like, and for the next sessions, we can definitely take more questions. Billy, would we be needing the screen, or can we turn the screen sharing?
No, I can
just
have it.
Sweet. Yeah, I can just see everyone on the gallery view. Just more cool to see a lot of people together. But yeah, I think Nathaniel, I hope I'm not pronouncing your name wrong, have a question. Feel free to go for it.
Yeah, so Bill, how do you become a better problem solver? What are your tips, and like, do you still do coding exercises? Do you still lead code even though you're working for Facebook? Yeah, what are your tips on becoming a better problem solver?
This is going to be the simplest thing I'm probably going to say all night. I always ask myself, what can I do to become unstuck? Like, a lot of writing code is figuring out ways to become unstuck, right? Like, you've been tasked to do a thing because nobody knows how to do it, basically. And so the answer is that you sit there and you figure it out somehow or other. Like, I say yes to doing things all the time that I have no idea how to do. And so the first question I always ask myself is like, I run as fast as I can into a thing until I get stuck. And then I say, what can I do? Like, what are the options on the table? And, sometimes I get in my own head and I stop myself from picking an option and diving in, but it's actually better because like I'll do this to unblock myself, where I say like, okay, like, you're stuck. There's maybe 2 or 3 ways to look at this. You can look at the debugger, you can, look at your code, you can look at somebody else's code, you can look something up on the internet. Those typically are sort of the main options in front of you, or talking to, somebody in your team. And you just try to evaluate like, okay, like I've got these 4 or 5 potential solutions to this problem, and which one seems like it's going to be the best fit for this problem. And then once I figured that out, I just immediately run at that and say like, hey, like, teammate, you've done this before. You're an iOS engineer. I don't know anything about iOS. How do we incorporate that? Like, what kind of knowledge do you have that I can learn here? And it's sort of that very simple, like, just remembering to always ask yourself, like, how can I get unblocked right now? Because often I find that I get nervous at work, where it's like, oh God, like, I don't want to go to the other team without like doing all this pre-work and homework and blah, 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 blah. And that's often very rarely the case. And, to the regard that like, we're all people, we all understand that everybody's sort of figuring it out as we go, even at Facebook. I mean, I do this every day. I know tons and tons of senior engineers that couldn't tell you anything about a lot of things, but they do know how to solve problems. you know, as far as your, you know, your comment on like doing leak code, for example, like, yes, I still spend time doing that. It's definitely not something that I spend like a lot of time on, with the exception of like when I'm ramping up for an interview. So for example, I just changed types of engineering at Facebook and, or like at the start of this year. And so I spent like 2 months sort of like every morning I would spend about 30 to 60 minutes going through questions, and like that was a good mechanism for me to sort of like dust off the cobwebs of some of that knowledge and prepare for the interview process. You know, but and like another piece that really helps too is like once you start to figure some of these things out, you can, you know, you can volunteer and do stuff like this even, of, you know, like helping other people learn and other people go through these kinds of problems. Like I've volunteered quite a bit over the years of teaching people how to code, and you know, a lot of the times people come to you with questions about like data structures and algorithms. I don't know why this always happens to me as like a coach when I do this kind of thing, but I run into that problem all the time. And so like, it's sort of fun to try to explain to somebody like, how does a hash table work? You know, because even after you've figured out like how hash table algorithms work, you have to figure out, how do I explain that to somebody who doesn't know anything about it? You know, and that actually makes you a better interviewee, and it makes you a better coder because you're actually thinking a little bit more deeply about like, how is this using memory? Like, what's the more or less efficient way of doing a particular thing? Also, quite frankly, Nathaniel, I want to point this question back at yourself. How do you become a better problem solver? Sorry, you get to be the challenge of the evening as somebody that I know has been an engineer for a number of years now.
Well, yeah, very similar to what you do. I also go out there and look for, yeah, like help other people solve their own problems. So either Stack Overflow, or when I go to some tutorial websites, because for example Udemy, they have an actual community on specific tutorials in there. So if you help those people out, yeah, you're actually encountering other people's problem, which will also teach you how to you know, become a better programmer.
That's really cool. I didn't know Udemy had a feature like that.
Yeah, they have a like a forum in there. So some people actually build like a Discord, and some people use other platforms, but yeah, they actually build a forum where you can see all these problems from other students. So yeah, I agree with you.
Cool. Thanks for sharing.
Hey guys, any other questions? I think Jake is raising the hand. Jake, go for it.
Hey, Billy, just wanted to say hi. How's it going? Can you hear me?
What's up, Jake? This is my cousin, everybody.
Thought I'd just drop in. Yeah, my mom said you were doing this, so I was like,
Well, wish your mom happy birthday for me. It's his mother's birthday, so.
next week. Yep, coming right up. We'll do. Yeah, I guess just a cool talk. I was just wondering, maybe, because I'm not just, I also, for the others, also program a little bit, but in terms of like learning stuff, I was thinking of like there's kind of tools that you use. So like your editor, your IDE, and then there's languages and libraries that you're working with, and then also kind of the theory behind it. So do you do anything in particular about trying to dabble in each of those areas, or do you focus on certain ones more than others, or I guess what's your thought on that sort of separation?
Gotcha. Okay, so I'm gonna repeat this back just to make sure I heard you correctly, but you're asking about like what tools that I use to write code with, like what languages or frameworks that I dive in on, and you know, whether or not I sort of spend time trying to learn a little bit of everything versus maybe going deep on one thing.
So like like, for example, when I'm learning about stuff, it's like I'll maybe learn how to use my IDE a little more efficiently, like go into more of like bindings and just be more efficient. Or you can also just like learn more about the particular library you're working with, like, I don't know,
Yeah.
framework,
Okay.
Django, or whatever, the programming language itself. Or you like dig under the hood and try to understand some theory of the algorithms and things like that. Which is,
Okay. Yeah,
I guess,
great.
what's more relevant for you?
I think the best answer to this is everything in moderation. You know, it's small little hacks and tricks and things when it comes to getting, you know, becoming really good at using your tools can help you move a little bit faster. You know, like figuring out, I mean, one of my favorite things to do is, you know, highlighting like every instance of a particular keyword on a file and then changing it all at the same time, for example. Like that saved me, like when I learned how to do that, I used to do that by hand, one at a time. And that saved me a lot of time doing that. So like, I would say learning some of that kind of stuff is really helpful. You know, and it kind of goes with everything. Like I find that over the years, I've learned a lot of lessons by just learning really the basics of a lot of different tools and a lot of different frameworks or languages. Like when I was first getting started with Ruby, I was using Ruby on Rails. And at the time I was doing a lot of work in C# and ASP.NET. And I was learning a lot about both of those things from the other thing, which was like kind of weird, where like I would sit down to write Ruby and then it would hit me of like a better way to write C#. And vice versa. That was like kind of cool, where, you know, like you sort of start to see like some of the tips and tricks that different things, you know, different tools have and different programming languages might have, and like how you can maybe, you know, use a different tool a little bit strangely to accomplish whatever it is that you're trying to do. You know, at the core of all of this too, like I think is important to keep in mind, like what is fun to you. You know, for example, like I'm not going to go dive in on like, I don't know, like Rust. Everybody's all about Rust right now as a coding language in the sort of DevOps world. And I just am not a DevOps person. Like I've been there, I've tried it, it's not for me. And so I know I'm just not going to go try to learn that, because I'm just going to be very unhappy with myself and with my day if I like try to jump in and do that. You know, I'm willing to be proven wrong on that one day. If I end up in a situation where somebody's like, do it or else, then like, fine, like I'll sit down, we'll do it, you know. But, you know, it's really all about like what entertains you, like, what are you excited about, and where can you sort of learn enough basics about various things to sort of take those lessons elsewhere.
And then maybe one last thing is, so I don't know, all these kind of like modern resources for learning stuff, like some article or some YouTube video, are there any kind of more traditional, let's say a textbook that you really found to be somewhat timeless and still refer back to?
Here, give me a second, I'll get it. The correct answer is yes. This book, let's see if it'll do it. Oh man.
Probably turning off the blur.
Yeah, one sec, I'll turn it off real quick. All right, this book, so it's called Cracking the Coding Interview. This is a really, really great resource for just sort of walking through the basics of data structures and algorithms problems. And in particular, this book was actually written to help people get jobs at all the big tech companies. And there are separate like parts of it where they literally walk through like, here is the, you know, here's the process for what an interview at Apple is like, and at Google and Facebook and like all of these types of places. And whether or not you want to work at those kinds of places is almost irrelevant, because most if not all of the industry kind of does a relatively standard interview process. And the lessons that you learn from this book are sort of broken up into the different types of data structures and algorithmic you know, categories that might exist. And it's just kind of like a really great resource for occasionally like flipping through and just sort of saying like, okay, like I like, you know, sometimes I'll sit down and say like, I just really want to practice like, I don't know, trees. And so, you know, right there on the page, there's 10 different problems about trees. They're all different enough that you know that there's not really going to be any repeat in the, you know, like the types of ways you solve the problems. So like the problems themselves are written very cleverly. Whereas like sometimes when you're on Leak Code or like HackerRank or some of these websites, like, and you go from question to question, the questions are sometimes very, very similar. And I find that that can be sort of annoying where you're like, oh, I just solved this problem. Why am I solving this one again? So yeah, that's definitely the one book.
Cool. Thanks.
No worries. Thanks for joining, Jake. And Nathaniel, big shout outs. Former coworker and cousin.
That's awesome. Thanks for joining, guys. And good to see like always like new faces. I'd love to touch base maybe sometime and just get to know you guys as well. Any other questions, guys? I think Fairuz, you have some question?
Yes, so I had a question. So before your interviews, how did you prepare yourself? Just this book, or did you go over some other courses to prepare yourself better for interviews for a job?
So it's a lot of this kind of thing depends on what works for you when it comes to learning. You know, something that I think you'll see, and you know, like you guys actually have the best example here of all being like a cohort of students where everybody's going to learn a little bit differently. And this was sort of what I was getting at with the self-serve learning techniques of, you know, for some people having a book is really useful. For some people having like a website that you can just go like, you know, crank on like question after question is useful, or just talking to somebody else is super useful. So I would say like experiment around and find what types of resources work for you. Like I know that like video and audio are not for me when it comes to this type of problem. You know, like learning, like I really like reading and I really like doing. And so those are the types of things that I will look to try to find. You know, in terms of interview prep specifically for me, it's, I would say that I kind of flop between Leak Code and this book, honestly. You know, because especially too, like as you get further in your career, when you're doing interviews, the questions that you get asked just get to be really tricky, where it's no longer just like, hey, can you like sort this thing? It's like, hey, can you sort this thing, find some information about it, make a decision, and then return a number. And by the way, you have to use 2 different data structures while you do it, right? And so the problems just get really, there's a lot of layers to them that you have to peel back. But ultimately, all of it comes down to the same set of like very simple problems. And so like earlier this year when I was prepping for my interviews, some of my friends were like, oh, are you trying out like a lot of the hard questions because like it's Facebook and it's a big thing? And I was like, no, I'm just doing the easy ones. And it's silly, but it's all of the hard questions are really just like multiple easy questions that are bound up inside of each other. And so it's important to just get really, really good at identifying what, you know, like when you look at a problem, like, okay, what's the next step I can do to get from A to B so that I can get to C? And like that type of thing is, I think, way more valuable than understanding like what's a really complex one, like knight problems, for example, like chessboards and knights and moving them around. Like those problems can be such a pain in the rear. But if you distill them down, they can become very, very simple problems. You know, it's just a question of like, how do I divide it up so that it's not one big problem, it's like 4 small problems. Is that helpful? Does that answer? I feel like I tangented a little bit.
Thank you. That was helpful.
Hey guys, anyone else wants to ask any question? This is great. Thank you, Billy, for taking all the questions and all the time in answering them in depth.
No worries. I mean, thank everybody for being here too. Like this is, I mean, it's, I don't know, I'm on the East Coast and it's 10 o'clock, like it's late, it's a Tuesday, everybody's tired, I'm sure they want to go to bed. You know, but this kind of thing, like continuing to try to learn from the community around you, however that's defined, is such an important part of, I think, everybody's learning process. Like, you know, this idea of like the coder that sits in the corner who becomes an expert I think is a really big myth. I think that learning from each other is the most powerful thing that any of us can do to just sort of like improve in our lives, you know, like definitely in coding, but in life too. You know, I mean, it's like we only face one set of problems in the day. And as soon as you talk to somebody else to learn what their problems are, you've just doubled your knowledge.
For sure, for sure. 100%. I don't think anyone thinks that being in a corner and being a coder will make you a great coder. I don't think anyone believes that.
That's good. I question that sometimes.
That's great. Anyone else have any questions? If not, what we can do is that we can wrap this up. I think this is good. Billy, like, thanks a lot for doing this for us, like on such a, you know, like we casually met and discussed, and you're just here and like, you know, like sharing your wisdom for our students or like any participants. Do you have any thoughts you wanted to share? And also, like, if the students wanted to connect with you, what is the best way? Like, I don't know, like LinkedIn or like, what are the best ways for people to connect with you? And if you have any closing thoughts or advice or anything you wanted to share. And thank you again for doing this. This has been amazing.
Thank you, Sam. This was sort of funny at how we just sort of, you know, we were casually discussing, hey, should we do this? And now 2 weeks later, we're doing it.
That's how things happen.
You know, it's cool how life works out like this. But yeah, in terms, you know, anybody can reach out to me, please. I'm always happy to chat. However, I will say there are 20 people on this call. If every one of you messages me after this, it might take me a few days to get back to all of you. I promise you, I'm not ignoring you. I'm very much a community person, very much a networking person. I love connecting people. It just, if everybody reaches out, it could take a little bit. Anywho, I'm super biased towards Facebook products just because I work at Facebook right now. And you literally have to be on Facebook to work at Facebook like throughout the day. So like that's a thing. As much as, I don't know, it's weird when you work at a social media company that's blocked in most workplaces and you're encouraged to do your work because, you know, you're writing code for it. So yeah, reach out to me. Like if CM has all my information, feel free to reach out to me on Facebook. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Those are probably the best places to get in touch with me. Email's another good one, but I like these sort of like platforms that are more focused on like the connections, because things don't like, you know, like your email won't get lost in spam on LinkedIn or on Facebook. Like it'll just go right to the account.
I was just raising my hand. It's a funny thing, like you are the first person literally in all the guests who came to our sessions who actually told them to told people to add them on Facebook. So it's that's like many of the students do not have us in Facebook. We all like are connected mostly through LinkedIn. I don't know if Facebook people use Microsoft based like I don't know if there's any animosity going on, or like if there are things higher level wars going on, but yeah, like LinkedIn, if LinkedIn is good, should I just give LinkedIn and Facebook both, or like what do you prefer? Because I want to take your permission beforehand.
They're both fine. Just, you know, be aware that if you add me on Facebook, you might see my Facebook updates. Like I'll see your Facebook updates too, you know, like, you know, I don't know how private or not anybody wants to be. One thing I will say though is like,
I gave both in the links, by the way. So
cool.
Whatever.
Like where I work is very strange in that, like, because you have to have a Facebook account to work at Facebook, although that's slowly changing to a bit of my dislike. Like I'm literally friends with all of my coworkers on Facebook. I'm friends with my boss's boss, his boss, that guy's boss, like everybody. And
wow.
It's like, it's silly, but it's cool in a way that's not, I don't know, like I went to business school when I went to college, and they had this really intense thing of like, you're a product of our school and you have to be professional and serious, and there's no like room for being different or special or unique. And like, honestly, those are the best things that any of us can do as far as I'm concerned. I really, really dislike it when people are, you know, try to be like too upfront and too serious, because I tried that for a while and it doesn't fit. Like, be you. You know, that's the best thing that you can ever bring to the table. You know, and is like why like what CM is doing here is really, really cool. And, you know, what all of you guys are doing in terms of like figuring out like, okay, like I want to get a job as an engineer. How do I do that? Like, you know, especially if you're doing it as an immigrant, like kudos to you. That's a hard thing to do. But keep at it, because we need this. Like so much of the coding industry looks like me, and it shouldn't. You know, it should look like the whole world. It should look like women and people of color and like everybody of every background. And so like I want to know what my coworkers are up to on their weekends and like go out with them every now and then and just like hang out, because it's like the cool, friendly thing to do. Like, I don't know, working at Facebook has taken away all of my professionalism, if you can't tell. So I'm very comfortable with that, you know, but just remember it's a two-way street. And so like, I might come to you one day and say, hey, I really need to connect you with this person. Here you go. Congratulations.
That's awesome, Billy. Like, yeah, I if everyone in Facebook is so friendly, then I mean, I think Facebook is a good place to work if that's the case. But I don't know. I think you're unique on that side. But yeah, yeah. It's like if everyone in Facebook is like friends with each other, it's interesting. I don't know how that would work out in a workplace, but because Facebook is also a social, like personal platform, and you have to be friends in Instagram and all Mark Zuckerberg platforms. Like, I don't know, I have so many questions now. Uh, but yeah, guys, thanks a lot for joining again and staying up late on a you know, like Tuesday night. And again, thanks a lot, Billy, for doing this. And yeah, I hope to see you all around. And that's it from my side.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody's
Thank
good
you,
night.
guys. Have a good night, guys.
Thank you.